The great thing about building your own furniture is that you can design it to meet your needs perfectly. You design it so that it fits in your space. You design it so that every shirt, every pair of pants, and every pair of shoes has its own place. It's almost as if you'll never get another...
Wait, no. No. That can't be right. Wait. I knew I planned that perfectly. I couldn't have miscounted.
Hey, babe.
Hey,
Hey, I'll never guess what I got you today.
what's that?
Well, I was at Adidas and they were having a sale, so I got you this new pair of shoes.
No.
While I break down this plywood, I want to admit something. Before building this wardrobe, I knew basically nothing about tambour. The only time I saw tambour doors was on a desk my grandma had when I was a kid. This is one of those old roll-top desks, probably from the 70s, and it looks something like this. I can't remember much about this desk, but I remember being fascinated with how it worked. A few months ago, I saw some tambour door projects, which I'll link in the description, and it reminded me of how cool these doors can be. I paired this with my need for a wardrobe, and then boom, 6 weeks later, weighing 225 pounds and 7 ounces, we welcomed her into our lives. Before I talk more about this build, I want to stress that I'm not an expert on tambour doors. This project was one huge experiment, and although I'm very proud of the way it came out, I'm not afraid to say I made some mistakes along the way. But I want to share those mistakes with you, so that hopefully you don't have to make them. Anyway, let's get back to the build. Now that I've cut all the shell pieces oversized with the track saw, I can trim them to their final dimensions on the table saw. Some people probably think I'm crazy for basically cutting each piece twice, but let me show you why I do this. Each matching color in this diagram has to be the exact same width. There are several repeating measurements here, and the table saw fence removes the human error from lining up the track saw each time. After I've trimmed everything, I can cut out the shoe shelves. These also have to be the same exact size. So after trimming the width of each board on the table saw, I use my crosscut sled with a stop block to ensure each piece is identical. And it looks pretty good to me. The next thing I have to do is make sure this tambour thing is actually going to work. Spoiler alert. You should test things before you buy a bunch of material for it, or at least before you cut that material. I basically wasted 2 sheets of maple plywood assuming that 3/4 inch material would work. And technically it would have worked, but I wasn't really pleased with the aesthetics of this look. The gaps around the turns were much bigger than I wanted, so I went back to the drawing board. I did a test with 1/4 inch plywood instead, and it was exactly what I was looking for. Now that I've ensured these dimensions will work, it's time to build the doors. After cutting the doors to length on the track saw, it was time to cut all of the pieces that make up the doors. I wanted to keep the grain pattern continuous on the doors, but I knew that after cutting each door into 140 little pieces, it would take forever to match up the grain. To make this as easy as possible, I ran a strip of blue tape diagonally across the panel and added a marker line to represent each of the doors. As long as I never flipped any of these pieces, I would be able to line them up using the placement of the blue tape. While I'm building these doors, I want to go over some of the mistakes I made. With the first door, I was trying to cut panels that were way too big on my tiny table saw, with no push block or roller stand. Huge rookie mistake. I was so worried about keeping as much grain continuation as possible, I didn't want to break the panels up more than I had to. Looking back, a couple extra cuts to make the doors more manageable made no difference at all with the grain pattern. Having bigger panels also resulted in poorer cuts. If you think about it, after every cut I make, I'm referencing that cut against the fence, which normally isn't that big of a deal when you're only cutting a few pieces. But each door is made of 140 pieces. So don't do this. The grain isn't that important. After cutting all the pieces for the doors, it was time to line them back up and create the tambour. The blue tape made lining up these doors super quick and actually really satisfying. Here you can see how the grain will continue through the door once it's assembled. To keep the pieces snugly pressed together, I made a jig out of a sheet of plywood with strips of wood screwed around it to hold everything in place. I used some extra scrap to keep some of the plywood pieces flat as I lined everything together, and although some of this wood wants to be unique, making it into tambour forces it to conform. With the door held together, I laid the canvas out to cut it to size. After this, I started spreading wood glue on the back of the door. With the wood glue spread, I could lay out the fabric. It's important to get all of the creases out of the fabric and make sure everything is nice and taut. I used an iron to smooth out any wrinkles while helping the wood glue set. While the wood glue is drying, I trimmed the canvas fully to size, and after about 15 minutes, I removed the frame around the door and flipped the door over. The next step is to go through and separate all of the door pieces. I found that the easiest way to do this is to slowly hang the door off of the edge of the jig, separating one slat at a time. You can see that some of these are hard to separate already because a little glue slipped through. If you don't separate these now, the slats can actually become glued together, which results in you spending all that time cutting out 140 pieces to create another panel that doesn't bend. After I separated each piece, I stored the doors rolled up so the slats couldn't glue themselves together anymore. After completing what I thought would be the most stressful part of the build, I could start assembling everything together. A lot of layout and marking went in figuring out how to best assemble this. I started with laying out how the vertical pieces would attach to the top and bottom pieces. Normally, I'd be able to line up the vertical pieces with the outside of the tops and bottoms, but because this wardrobe has doors that wrap all the way around, everything has to be assembled with an inch of clearance on each side. This made layout a little more challenging, but after figuring it out, all I had to do was mark the domino placements and let this thing do the rest of the job. After completing these pieces, I needed to repeat the process for the shoe shelves and the piece above the drawer. The main concern for this stage of the project was making sure that the shelf support was lined up in the middle of the board and that the shelves were flush with the side panels. After everything was ready for assembly, it was time to round over the corners of the top, bottom, and shoe supports. I started by creating the radius I wanted on a scrap piece of plywood and then using the spindle sander to create the profile. Once I had the radius I wanted, I could use the plywood as a template for all of the corners. After the corners have been rounded, I could create the groove that the tambour doors will slide in. I decided to use an edge guide to cut this groove, which worked perfectly on the straight portions. But for my test run, I knew it would be difficult to get perfect around the corners. To give myself a line to follow around the curves, I marked where each curve would be. This really helped me stay on track, but if I do this again, I'll buy some bushing guides from my router and create a template to follow. It worked fine this way, but it's not as perfect as I would like. Because I used maple plywood for this project, and the core for this plywood isn't as pretty as Baltic birch, I used iron-on edge banding for everything that would be visible. This was a pretty tedious process, but making all of the panels out of solid wood would probably have taken more time and been a lot more expensive. Regardless, it came out pretty nicely. Now that I know exactly how much space is between the two side panels, I can cut the panel above the drawer along with the drawer components. I assembled the drawer using pocket screws and cut a rabbet along the bottom of the drawer for the bottom piece to fit in. With the drawer assembled, it was time to install it. I wanted this drawer to be flush with the sides, but I'm going to put a false drawer front on it later. So I clamped a piece of plywood flush with the frame and marked where the drawer should end. This allowed me to install the drawer with just the right amount of clearance for the front. Now it's time to create the leg assembly, and instead of plywood, I'll be using solid maple for this. There's two big things to consider with this assembly. The first being the rounded corners that have to be flush with the bottom of the wardrobe, and the second being this curve going from the leg to the apron. I Ideally, I want the leg and apron to be made up of only 2 pieces, but I didn't have enough maple to do that. Instead, I had to make them out of 3 pieces. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the saying, they were so busy asking whether or not they could do it, they didn't stop to think if they should. Well, that was me when planning the joinery for this assembly. I have a domino, so why not use it for everything, right? Well, this joint right here is why. End grain being glued to side grain. It isn't the worst thing with a loose tenon supporting it, which the domino would do, but I probably should have made this a half lap joint instead. It wouldn't have been that much more work, and the strength would definitely be worth it. But hindsight's 20/20, right? With everything milled, it was time to figure out the exact dimensions of the leg parts. Instead of measuring the dimensions of the bottom and trying to figure out the exact cuts I needed to make, I lined these pieces up against the bottom and marked where to make the cuts. With everything cut to size, I could lay out the assembly, domino the joints, and do a dry fit. With the legs together, it was time to lay out some of these curves. For the 4 leg corners, I laid the bottom on top of the assembly and traced the curves onto the leg pieces. Then I used a template to trace the pattern for the leg to apron curve. To create the curve on the corner leg pieces, I had to think outside of the box a little. I started by removing most of the material with the table saw. From here, I would have liked to use a spoke shave or a plane to get most of the way to the line, but I don't have either of those. So instead I decided to use a belt sander. This worked fine, but I think I want to add some finesse with the spoke shave in the future, so stay tuned for that. With the legs smoothed up, the assembly is ready for glue up. After everything's dry, I can clean up the leg to apron curve with a template, and then attach the bottom and legs together. I couldn't risk dominoes coming through the track in the bottom piece, so I glued these mounting blocks on the inside of the legs. This ensured that the dominoes would be far enough away from the track, and I wouldn't even have to worry about the placement. The next thing I need to do is add these supports for the dowel. I decided to cut this out on my CNC machine, along with a template for me to route out the pocket these will fit in. With the template ready, I cut out the pocket on the side panels. And now it's time to start putting this thing together. Now that the drawer's in place, I can build and install the drawer front. I use playing cards to space out the gaps around the front evenly and double-sided tape to secure the front in place while I screw the mounting holes. Before installing the doors, the first thing I did was apply a healthy amount of furniture wax to the top and bottom grooves. This will remove some friction and help the door to slide smoothly. I also chose to screw the top on instead of gluing it. The dominoes will still provide strength in these joints, but I wanted to be able to remove the top in case something happened with the doors. Putting the doors in was trickier than I imagined, but once they were in, everything was working really smoothly. Something I didn't plan for was the way that these doors would meet. With this being my first time ever doing something like this, and choosing to build doors that were 58 inches tall, they didn't really meet up square. In an attempt to fix this, I took the doors off and cut a straight edge with my track saw. I even alternated them so that any discrepancy with my track saw would be eliminated once the doors met together. This almost solved the problem, but there was still a small gap. So instead of trying to get these perfect, I decided to install door handles that would run the length of the door and cover up any inconsistencies. To give the handles a little more rigidity, I decided to epoxy some flat bar steel on the back of the door. And then as a final touch, I added these walnut tabs to keep the doors aligned. And now, after more hours than I'd like to admit, it's finished. If you decide to make something with Tambour doors, let me know how it goes for you. This wardrobe is going to be a part of a matching bedroom set, so I'll be experimenting with ways to improve the doors in the future. If you like what you see, please consider subscribing to my channel or sharing this video with whoever you think would enjoy it. It helps more than you know. And thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Past Envy. Take it easy.